In this video, I want to talk about presentational knowing, and I quite specifically want to talk about the poetics of ontopoetics. And in doing this, I'm taking a leaf out of the book of Professor Nathan Grunstein, who was my first teacher when I did my PhD. And he used to come into the room with a book and stand in front of us and inquire into what the book was saying, or a text or something. And he did what I think all good teachers would do at this kind of level, which was to publicly explore what he didn't really understand and use that exploration as a means of developing understanding. And that's what I'm doing here. Because this whole field of speaking poetically, which is implied in the whole idea of ontopoetics, is necessarily one that we can't speak about directly. And so I can only point. And I can only point for myself. And I have here a pile of books that I want to pick different bits out to you, really to give you some kind of a map that you might like to use for your own exploration, or indeed you might like to go off on completely your own track. So in the field of cooperative inquiry, John Heron talks about presentational knowing, and he talks about it very explicitly as an intuitive grasp of the significance of patterns. And it's expressed in the words he uses: graphic, plastic, moving, musical, verbal art forms. And he claims it's the ground of propositional knowing. I think it's more than that. I think it's a way of knowing in its own right. And notice that I use the term knowing rather than knowledge, and maybe we should use the term coming to know, or maybe not even that. So it's interesting just to note that when John first conceived of the extended epistemology, it only had three epistemologies: experiential, propositional, and practical. And he added presentational knowing, and I think in doing so has opened up a whole important field of exploration. So Freya says, and I'll read this is an invitation to ontopoetics: our lives harbour possibilities of poetic manifestation far larger than those defined by the materialist terms of modern societies. These possibilities derive from our inviting reality to use us as opportunity for new stories, new meanings that story landscapes, earthquakes, at the same time as they story ourselves. It's to invite reality to use us as a terrain for stories, and it's clearly making an epistemic shift from knowledge in somewhat objectivist way to imagination as our primary epistemic modality, a move from knowledge to imagination. Except we can think of imagination as a form of knowing. And then she says, this is Living Cosmos Panpsychism: from this perspective, the language the world speaks, when it does speak, is a poetic, concretized and particularized one. For example, and she says this in her talk, it may take the form of a bush burning on a mountain, a raven participating discreetly in a funeral ceremony, a butterfly alighting on a dead woman's breast, so on and so forth. Lightning punctuating a ritual performance with apposite displays. All such signs, whether occurring in religious contexts or not, may be seen as instances of the vast poetic repertory, a repertory of imagery, she says, of meaning conveyed through the symbolic resonance of things. And in such a language, then, our invocations may need to be couched, since it is in such a language that the world is able to respond. It's able to speak things. Okay, So you've lots of stuff from Freya that you can read. I want to turn, the other place you might like to look for Freya is the introduction of the first chapter, Love and Metaphysics, of her book, For Love of Matter, which is an earlier piece around the same thing. What does it mean to be enchanted? Literally, it means to be wrapped up in chant or song or invocation. So that's a lovely piece. Okay, so I want to turn to another author, another writer who's influenced me a lot recently, which is Andreas Weber. I'll give you a list of all these references with the page numbers. Andreas Weber is a biologist. He's a rather radical sort of biologist. And he talks about poetic ecology. The book is called The Biology of Wonder. So he calls his viewpoint poetic ecology. It's poetic because it regards feeling and expression as necessary dimensions of the existential reality of organisms, not as an epiphenomena. And I call it ecology because all life builds on relations and unfolds through mutual transformations. Poetic ecology restores the human to the rightful place within nature, without sacrificing the otherness and the strangeness and the nobility of other beings. And then on page 12, he talks about something I think is really interesting, because poetry isn't about verse or flowery language or strange concepts. He talks about poetic precision. Living physical beings are interconnected with a living world that brings forth existential experience and inwardness. We share a rich common ground with all other things. But to reach this new point of departure, we must expect this common ground is not objective in the rational empirical sense. It's defined by what he calls poetic objectivity. All organisms share an empirical subjectivity, a subjectivity that is a defining feature of the biosphere. So we're not getting rid of subjectivity. We're seeing it has a basis in what we see, what we experience, and we can explore and examine it. And in another book called Matter and Desire, a later book, he gets more specifically into this, and a rather nice example, I think, of the difference between literalism and poetics, which we'll come to later. So he starts off, this is on page 88, he wants to establish the connection between the transformative power that's our lived experience and the imaginative power of poetry. The poetic mode of perception and our experience as life forms are intimately connected. Poetry is an expression that conceives the world verbally or artistically, but not through explanation. And there's all sorts of other stuff there. We can understand this precisely because we are part of their reality. That's what he was saying in that earlier piece. We're able to understand the poetics of the world because we too are part of that poetics. We too are poetic creatures. And he goes back to Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson compares the sort of classical logic, going back to the Greeks, what's known as the syllogism in Barbara, for some reason that I'm not quite clear of. But it's a familiar one. Men die. Socrates is a man. Socrates will die. And it's a logical sequence through. And then he offers us an alternative, the syllogism in grass, which goes, grass dies, men die, men are grass. And I think, he's catching there that shift from the logical to the metaphorical. Yeah, and so that's a section worth getting hold of and having a look at. So I want to turn to some poets now. This is, hold on, let me look at my notes again. This is Steffler, John Steffler, and it's you've got the reference somewhere in the bibliographies I've given you. Steffler was a poet laureate in Canada. He's a Canadian poet. I just thought this was a nice way of putting it. I sometimes, this article goes on a bit to begin with, and then it hits this business of poetry about 2/3 of the way through. I sometimes think that poetry is not so much a type of speech or a certain arrangement of words on a page, but as a state of awareness that can be induced by language, and in which we feel engaged and perhaps reconciled with what is natural to the world and larger than the self. So there's that sense of resonance that Andreas Weber was talking about. Other arts and practices can bring us to poetry in this sense. Poetry attempts to loosen our way of knowing in the world. It's as though instead of killing and stuffing an animal and bringing it back to decorate a hall, poetry attempts or pretends to go out into the field and be among the animals and know them in the wild. Questioning discrete facts, poetry explores ambiguity, layered meanings, hints, uncertainty, paradoxes, mixtures, transitions. Poetry tends to aim not for much a dualistic knowledge of facts, as for a unified sense of being in an experience, involved in the happening. And another poet who I find quite fascinating and sometimes, again, quite beyond me, is Robert Bringhurst. And this in an article, Everywhere Being is Dancing, Knowing is Known, which again is on your list to look at if you want to. He starts off by saying, I do not know how poetry knows. What it knows, I cannot say myself. That it knows seems to me only a kind of tautology, poorly phrased. I would rather say that poetry is one among many forms of knowing, and maybe it's the purest form we know. I would rather say that knowing, freed from the agenda of possession and control, knowing in the sense of stepping in tune with being, hearing and echoing the music and heartbeat of being, is what we mean by poetry. Does poetry know anything different from music, painting or dance? It's not a question about knowing, but the different languages or fields of specialization. Poetry is the knowing of which music and painting are the known. Music and painting are equally names for knowing. What poetry knows, or what it strives to know, is the dancing at the heart of being. That is what the dance knows too, or strives to know, although it's not a human dance. So again, that's a poetic form of expression. The dance of the world is a language of things. Poetry is knowing. Knowing is moving in tune with being. And so on. And later in this chapter, in this article, he makes a distinction between poetry and verse. It's not about verse. Verse is a formal kind of poetry. Where did we find that? Just at the end here. He says, and this is where we'll come to in his other book. He's very, very interested. He's a student of the Haida culture, and he speaks Haida, and he's very concerned with the importance of orality. And he says, Ornate and elaborate forms of verse are rarely present in societies without other elaborate technologies. Verse is worked language, farmed language, and poetry, like other forms of knowing, is a kind of food. Farming doesn't, strictly speaking, create food. Farming regulates its production and sometimes increases its yield. That is the relation of verse to poetry. So you don't need to be bothered. You can't write verse, or you can't write in rhythms or in haikus or anything like that. That's not the point. The point is the way we catch, the way we address, the way we reflect in a way that is metaphorical and dancing rather than explicit. So I'm going to carry on, although you may feel I've said enough already. Just because I want to pick up, oh yeah, I think this is another nice example around it not being poetry. He starts the paragraph with this: "Look where the morn in russet mantle clad peeps o'er the brow of yon high eastern hill," which I had to look up. It's from Hamlet. And he says this is kind of metaphor clad in a russet mantle of elaborated diction. What it means, at least in one sense of the word, is look, the sun is rising. And go to the Department of Astrology and Physics and they'll tell you the sun is doing nothing of the sort. Actually, it's the earth going round. You're speaking in a metaphor. So let's try to strip the metaphor away. Let's reduce to one monosyllable: sun. Now we can have true 24-carat metaphor. We haven't spoken any predicate out loud, and yet there it is, sun. How can it be a metaphor when it's a monosyllabic acknowledgement of the matter-of-fact reality? By being exactly that. When you come down to elemental things, earth, air, fire, water, wind, sun, moon, a scrap of birdsong, you will find that metaphor, or poetry to call it by its other name, is a fundamental property of things. You will find that things are deviant predicates of themselves. So the emphasis is on this world as being itself a metaphorical entity, and that's how we have to address it. Okay, there's another poem here I will read to you. This is from Robert Bly's book. Poet Robert Bly, done a lot of work in the men's movement, News of the Universe, where he's talking about the move from one-fold consciousness to two-fold consciousness, to borrow Blake's analogy. And he has this translation of a poem by Goethe. There is a stillness on the tops of the hills. In the treetops, you feel hardly a breath of air. The small birds fall silent in the trees. Simply wait. Soon, you too will be silent. And he quotes some remarks. Goethe's short poems have a strange ring to them. They're entirely impersonal. In fact, you could say that they're not created by a person, but by nature. In them, a person is not seen as an I, but as a part of something else. And so he makes a very strong distinction between the I poet, who brings us news of the human mind, and another sort of poet who brings us news of the universe, which is the title of this book, of course. The I poets are sometimes classical, sometimes not. And he says there is a movement between those, And he thinks particularly about people like Novalis, Goethe, Basho, as people who are non-I poets. I'd just like to mention another poem and another book. This is from The Song of the Earth by Jonathan Bate, who is a professor of an English professor of English. And he looks in a lot of detail at John Keats' famous poem To Autumn, which I imagine many of you will know of, if not know in detail. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend to the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and to fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer hath o'erbrimmed their clammy shells. And what Jonathan Bate says about this is that it's a poem of networks. A poem of networks, links, bonds and correspondences. Linguistically, it achieves its most characteristic effects by making metaphors seem like metonymies. Mist and fruitfulness, bosom friend and son, load and bless, are not naturally linked pairs in the matter of bird and wings. Keats makes the link seem natural, the progression from one thing to another. And so the poem, Jonathan Bate says, the poem thus seems to resemble a well-regulated ecosystem. Keats has an intuitive understanding of the law of community ecology, and the human is embedded. He says it's like the poem is written from the inside. It's not like Keats' other famous poem, Ode to a Grecian Urge, where he's looking at it and getting into a transcendental kind of place. Here, it's very earthy. He's very embedded. And so the poem itself is an image of ecological wholeness, which may grant to the attentive and receptive reader a sense of being at home in the world. And I suspect that is why it's such a favourite and much loved poem. Think globally, the poem might say, act locally. And again, act locally, we're back to something very close to that idea of a language of things, a language of materiality, not of abstraction, but of presence. I'm not going to go into it now, but there's other references to Heidegger's use of this in Being Salmon, Being Human. I'll give you the page numbers for that. I just want to finish this talk, this video, by just picking up a book I've only just got hold of and only this morning finished reading, but I think it helps in another way. It's a book about James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, and Henri Corbin, who was a student of Persian mystics and Sufi Islam. And it makes the difference between the icon and the idol and the whole question of fundamentalism. The distinction between the literal and the imaginal. And I think what the book is saying is that we are so hooked onto the literal that we lose the imaginal. And by being hooked on the literal, it becomes an idol. So science becomes an idol. It is what we, in a sense, worship. And of course, there's a very close link between fundamentalist monotheisms of all kinds and that worship of the idol, even though they object to the idol, but it's the idol of the one truth. So he's saying anything that is literal, anything that we say, we try to pin down this rock, this book, this truth, anything that we try to pin down is already an abstraction. Isn't that interesting? The literal is always abstract because reality is so much more than we can ever know or experience or imagine. So as soon as we try to pin down something in being a truth, we are all abstracting ourselves away from it. We are already creating that separateness, that subject and object. And so this invites us to move into an imaginal worldview. James Hillman says what makes madness is literalism. And he emphasizes the importance of deliteralizing, opening the human to the surround in which we're embedded, which ultimately is the anima mundi, the soul of the world. So we are in psyche rather than psyche being in us. And here, of course, we're so close to Freya Matthews' view of panpsychism. And even more than that, he says we must speak materially. So just as Freya is saying the world speaks in a language of things, James Hillman and the archetypal psychologists are saying we need to return to the materiality of the world. Concepts have to be deliteralized and materialized because, as I've already said, what is literal, the truth, is already abstract. We have to understand the fundamentally poetic basis of experience, tuned to our poetic sensibilities. And this is quite like the practice of phenomenology. A phenomenological attitude opens us to all experience. We try to suspend our preconceptions of what is open. Everything is real. We don't know what's important. We attend to the world out there. So that's quite a lot of stuff around poetics, which, as somebody who is brought up in basically a scientific worldview and has been exploring this for longer than I want to think, these ideas seem to me tantalizing in moving us away from a dualist, materialist worldview. It's really interesting to do a materialist worldview and returning to the things as they are. I'm sure some of you will be more interested in these ideas than others. So this is an offering, my own exploration that obviously has got a lot of work to do, which I hope may be of interest to you. Thank you.